What if everything you've been taught about power, religion, morality, even spirituality, was nothing but a lie designed to keep you weak? Imagine discovering that true authority doesn't come from God, nor from demons, but from a forbidden formula that twists the soul itself. This is where the story of Aleister Crowley begins. To some, he was a madman, to others, a prophet. But in truth, he was something far more unsettling, a living experiment of possession, ritual magic, and forbidden knowledge. His life wasn't about worship, it was about rewriting the rules of reality. And that's exactly what makes the dark doctrine of Crowley, possession, power, and ceremonial magic so dangerous and so irresistible. It's not a tale of myths from the past, it's a mirror for anyone daring to question the structures that govern their life. Crowley Magick dared to say out loud what most only whisper, that freedom comes not from obedience, but from surrendering to forces that terrify us. He showed the world that ritual magic wasn't superstition, but machinery, that possession wasn't a curse, but the key to unlocking will. The paradox. The same doctrine that promised liberation also devoured those who followed it. And that's where our journey begins, in the haunting silence of a question few dare to ask. What if the only way to gain power is to lose yourself first? There's a question that lingers like smoke in an old temple. What if real power is not granted by divine grace, nor stolen from demons, but summoned through a doctrine so forbidden it reshapes the soul itself? This was the path walked by Aleister Crowley, the man many called the Beast 666. But to reduce him to a caricature of rebellion would be a mistake. Crowley Magick was not theatre, it was technology. It wasn't about stage tricks or empty symbols, but about opening a doorway in the human psyche where possession becomes possible, where will fuses with occult currents that most dare not touch. Thelema was the language, but possession was the grammar. Crowley once suggested that his life itself was a ritual, an ongoing invocation written into his flesh and breath. Imagine living every waking moment as if it were part of a ceremony. That's how he framed existence. He didn't simply study ceremonial magic, he embodied it. His presence in a room was described as electric, unsettling, almost inhuman, as if the very air bent around him. Some whispered he was possessed, others claimed he had mastered possession. In truth, perhaps both were correct. Crowley occult traditions often thrive in paradox, where being devoured is also to devour. And this is where the haunting whisper begins. Was Crowley merely channeling forbidden knowledge? Or had he become a vessel of something older, something watching through his eyes? His dark doctrine wasn't written like scripture, it was lived like a haunting. Those who met him spoke of feeling as if their own thoughts were not entirely their own in his presence, as though his will could slide beneath their skin. Possession was not a metaphor in his world, it was the currency of true power. And for those who sought initiation, Crowley rituals were the gateway to that dangerous exchange. Consider this. While religions preached surrender to a god outside oneself, Crowley's left-hand path asked the seeker to surrender to what was hidden inside, and then, beyond that, to entities waiting in the unseen. Unlike the Golden Dawn, which cloaked itself in hierarchies and secrecy, Crowley stripped the veil and declared that magic rituals could pierce the flesh of reality itself. He offered no safety net. If you invoked, you had to be ready for the consequences. Possession, after all, doesn't always return what it takes. Think of the impact this had on his followers. Some approached his occult secrets expecting knowledge, only to find themselves entangled in experiences they couldn't name. Imagine a student sitting across from him during a ritual, chanting words they barely understood, and suddenly feeling their heartbeat sync with his, their breath no longer their own. That's what it meant to enter Crowley possession. It wasn't about symbolic gestures, but about literally handing over control, if only for a moment, to something beyond comprehension. Crowley insisted that only through this surrender could the higher will emerge. There's also the paradox here. Was he liberating his disciples or binding them with chains made of desire and terror? His teachings whispered that one could achieve divine contact through ritual magic, yet the same teachings led others into madness, obsession, and ruin. Forbidden knowledge is never neutral. It carves scars as much as it opens doors. And Crowley knew this better than anyone, for he bore those scars himself. Every spell, every invocation carried with it a shadow that couldn't be ignored. But here's where the true enigma lies. Crowley himself never claimed to be merely human. He embraced the title of beast as if it were not insult, but initiation. He framed his existence as prophecy fulfilled, a vessel for forces larger than life itself. And if the opening whisper of his dark doctrine unsettles us, it's because it suggests that the line between man and myth, between human and possessed vessel, is thinner than we'd like to believe. Which brings us directly to the roots of this doctrine, how Crowley's path through the Golden Dawn and his eventual rupture with it forged the abyss from which his teachings emerged. When Aleister Crowley first stepped into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, he wasn't just seeking knowledge, he was seeking a throne within the invisible empire of occult secrets. The Golden Dawn was already infamous for its ritual magic, esoteric teachings, and mysterious initiations, yet Crowley wasn't content to simply follow. He wanted to bend the system, to test its boundaries. And like any soul destined for chaos, he found conflict early on. His clashes with other adepts weren't mere quarrels of ego, they were sparks revealing that his vision stretched beyond the order itself. Crowley rituals, even then, hinted at something darker, more dangerous, a left-hand path yet unnamed. The Golden Dawn was supposed to be a sanctuary of ceremonial magic, filled with symbols, robes, and oaths of secrecy. But Crowley saw it as a cage. He absorbed its occult teachings like a sponge, but instead of reverence, he grew restless. Imagine being in a classroom where the teacher keeps hinting at higher truths, but never dares reveal them. That's how he described his frustration. He wanted the abyss, not the veil. And so, his rupture was inevitable. The Golden Dawn was a garden. Crowley was looking for the wilderness. That's why he would later craft the dark doctrine of Crowley, a system that was less about obedience and more about invoking possession itself. It's important to understand, Crowley didn't throw away tradition, he reforged it. He took the structured rituals of the Golden Dawn, blended them with Hindu yoga, Buddhist meditation, and Sufi mysticism, and then stitched in elements of forbidden knowledge from grimoires he unearthed. What came out of this cauldron wasn't rebellion for its own sake, it was synthesis. Crowley occult teachings were not simply Western or Eastern, but something hybrid, something that lived in the cracks between cultures. That's why many feared him. He dared to combine what others insisted must remain separate. Picture him traveling through Egypt, India, and Nepal, taking notes, meditating, experimenting. To most tourists, these lands were exotic landscapes. To Crowley, they were laboratories of the soul. He learned pranayama not as health practice, but as a weapon of magic. He read Sufi poetry not for beauty, but as coded maps of possession. Crowley, magic was not a hobby, it was his bloodstream. Every breath, every chant, was part of an evolving doctrine that grew stronger as he stitched together fragments of ceremonial magic and living traditions. His break with the Golden Dawn was dramatic, even scandalous. Other adepts accused him of arrogance, of trying to wield power before earning it, but Crowley saw their accusations as proof that he was walking the true path. He once said that if magic was real, it had to transform the self so completely that others would no longer recognize you. And in that sense, he was succeeding. Thelema hadn't yet been born, but its seeds were germinating. Crowley was no longer just a member of an order. He was a storm, preparing to rewrite the very rules of ritual magic. And this rupture taught him something profound. True authority in the occult is never given. It's seized. The Golden Dawn could strip him of titles, but it couldn't strip him of will. In fact, his exile became his liberation. Free from the chains of esoteric orders, he crafted his own ceremonial path, one in which Crowley possession wasn't an accident, but the central engine of transformation. To follow him was to step away from safety and into the abyss, a place where identity itself was meant to dissolve, which is why the next stage in his journey becomes so pivotal. For out of this rupture, from the ashes of the Golden Dawn, emerged a phrase that would shake both occultists and outsiders alike. Do what thou wilt. And this is where the doctrine sharpened into law, where liberation and trap merged into one haunting command, the very essence of Thelema. When Aleister Crowley declared, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," he wasn't offering a slogan for freedom-loving rebels. He was building a spell. Those words weren't just a philosophy, they were incantation, repeated, meditated on, and lived. They acted as a trigger, unlocking parts of the psyche most people never dare to touch. In the dark doctrine of Crowley, language itself is ritual magic. To speak is to summon, to write is to bind, and so "do what thou wilt" became more than a creed. It became a living formula for invoking possession of the will. Most people read that phrase as a license for chaos. Eat what you want, love who you want, defy every authority. But Crowley's magic wasn't about shallow indulgence. He insisted that true will was not the same as fleeting desire. To know your will meant piercing past the ego, past conditioning, into something deeper, a demon, a guiding flame beyond the conscious mind. Thelema, then, wasn't mere anarchy. It was discipline disguised as rebellion, a spell wrapped in freedom. Those who misunderstood often got lost in their own desires, tangled in the very snare Crowley had warned about. Imagine someone hearing, "Do what thou wilt," and deciding it meant reckless abandon. They drink, gamble, consume, and call it liberation, but soon they're hollow, chained by their addictions, puppets of impulse. That's not Thelema, it's slavery. Crowley occult teachings demanded something far more terrifying, the courage to strip away every mask until only the true will remained. And that process felt less like liberation and more like possession. It was as if a hidden entity within the self took over, guiding every choice with ruthless precision. Crowley called this alignment. Others called it madness. In ceremonial magic, words are never neutral. A sigil carved on paper, a chant whispered in the dark, or a phrase carried like a mantra, all of these shape reality. Crowley knew that "do what thou wilt" would echo through the minds of his followers long after the ritual ended. Each repetition deepened the spell, pulling them closer to the abyss where will and demon merged. That's why Thelema is both empowerment and trap. It invites seekers to claim sovereignty, while quietly demanding they surrender to something far greater than themselves. Some adepts who followed this law reported moments of terrifying clarity. They spoke of waking up one day and realizing that every decision, career, love, even daily habits, was guided not by choice, but by a current flowing through them. Imagine standing at a crossroads and feeling your body move before you've even decided. That's the power of Crowley possession disguised as will. It's not just about choosing, it's about being chosen by your own hidden essence. The law becomes a mirror where the self sees its own chains and, paradoxically, its freedom. But the danger remained. How do you know that what you call true will isn't just another mask? Crowley warned that without discipline, the seeker could mistake ego for demon, craving for destiny, lust for law. And when that happens, "do what thou wilt" becomes the cruelest of traps. The doctrine devours those unprepared, twisting their lives into spirals of obsession. Yet for those who dared, it also opened doors to power unimagined. The paradox was the initiation. To follow the law, you had to risk being consumed by it. And so the question hangs in the air. If Thelema is both spell and snare, how far are you willing to go to discover whether your will is truly your own? Because for Crowley, the answer was possession, not metaphorical, but literal. The next step in his doctrine reveals this terrifying truth, that power arrives only when the self is devoured, when Crowley rituals invite entities to inhabit flesh and thought. That's where the law leads, into the dark mechanics of possession itself. For Aleister Crowley, possession wasn't the stuff of superstition or ghost stories. It was the very core of ceremonial magic. He taught that true transformation could not come from reading books, repeating prayers, or performing rituals mechanically. No, the dark doctrine of Crowley demanded that the seeker surrender completely, allowing forces beyond the human frame to take root inside their mind, body, and soul. Crowley possession wasn't seen as weakness, but as the highest form of empowerment. In his vision, the self wasn't destroyed, it was rewritten by something greater. Imagine stepping into a ritual chamber lit only by candles, with sacred geometry drawn on the floor. As the chants begin, your breath shifts, your heart races, and suddenly you feel as if your thoughts no longer belong solely to you. That sensation, half terror, half ecstasy, was what Crowley described as the moment the door opened. In that moment, the self is devoured. This was not a metaphor in his occult secrets, but a literal event, the merging of flesh with forces summoned through ritual magic. Crowley rituals weren't about play acting. They were designed to reprogram reality by reprogramming the human vessel itself. Crowley insisted that possession was not slavery, but cooperation. Entities weren't to be treated as demons chained to a circle. They were masters, guides, and sometimes tyrants that reshaped the magician. In Thelema, the idea of true will could only be discovered once the ego was silenced, and something else, some voice not born of the human mind, took the throne. Crowley magic turned the old formula upside down. Instead of commanding spirits, the adept invited them in, surrendered, and became their living altar. This teaching shocked even seasoned occultists. In most esoteric orders, like the Golden Dawn, the goal was control, summon an angel, bind a spirit, command a demon. But in the left-hand path of Crowley, the goal was the opposite. To give up control, to let possession flood through your veins, was to step into the abyss willingly. He argued that by being devoured, the seeker actually gained strength. It was a paradox. Lose yourself to find yourself. Let the mask of individuality burn away so that the raw fire of will could shine. The danger, of course, was immense. Crowley warned that possession could lead to madness, obsession, or even physical ruin if attempted without preparation. And yet, he sought it again and again, as if the risk itself was proof of authenticity. He spoke of entities that entered him during rituals, shifting his consciousness so profoundly that days later he would struggle to recall what was his own thought and what had been whispered by the unseen. Followers claimed to witness his voice change. His eyes darken, even his body contort during ceremonies. They saw possession not as theory, but as spectacle. And for some, this spectacle was a gateway. They too experienced fleeting moments where their bodies no longer felt like their own, where strange words tumbled out of their mouths unbidden. For Crowley, this was proof of progress. He believed that by being possessed, the seeker was purified, burned by the fire of higher forces until only will remained. In this view, possession wasn't corruption, but baptism by darkness. To resist was to remain small, to surrender was to become vast. Crowley occult teachings reframed fear as initiation. Yet every initiation pointed toward something more structured, more deliberate. Possession wasn't random, it was engineered. Crowley's dark doctrine had a machinery behind it, one built of sigils, blood, and invocation. If possession was the fire, then ritual was the engine. And to understand how he made possession repeatable, even transferable, We must now step into the mechanics of his magic, the sacred formulas, the symbols etched in secrecy, and the chilling technology of the soul that kept his doctrine alive. Crowley often said that magic was not superstition, but a science of the soul. To him, ritual was machinery, precise, repeatable, and designed to rewire the fabric of reality itself. He saw symbols not as decorations, but as gears in this invisible engine. A sigil wasn't just a drawing, it was a switch. Blood wasn't just a sacrifice, it was fuel. Invocation wasn't just chanting, it was programming. In the dark doctrine of Crowley, every ritual was a piece of technology, one meant to dissolve the barrier between flesh and spirit. Crowley rituals turned the human body into a laboratory, a place where ceremonial magic bent not only belief, but matter itself. Imagine the process: the circle carefully traced, the triangle prepared, candles placed to echo planetary forces. A novice might see theatrics, but to Crowley, these were wires and circuits in a machine built to harness occult electricity. The chanting was vibration, the geometry, architecture, the offering, a battery. In this frame, ritual magic stops being belief and becomes something like engineering. That's why Crowley magic appealed not only to mystics, but to those with scientific minds. He argued that if you repeated the experiment with the right elements, the result, possession, vision, transformation, would manifest every time. Blood, for instance, played a crucial role. In Crowley occult teachings, blood was the most concentrated form of life force available. He described it as the currency of the gods, a substance capable of charging rituals beyond imagination. But this didn't always mean violence. Sometimes the blood was symbolic, an offering of one's essence, or even sexual energy. Other times, however, it was literal. Crowley possession required fuel, and he wasn't afraid to name the cost. For him, the body itself was both temple and sacrifice, its fluids the ink with which forbidden knowledge was written. And then there were the sigils. Each curve, each line, each hidden letter carried weight. Crowley rituals often began with hours of preparation, drawing and meditating on sigils designed to attract specific entities. Think of a sigil as a lockpick for the unseen world. Once completed, it created resonance, a frequency that pulled a force into the ritual chamber. Followers reported that sometimes, even before the invocation began, they could feel a presence circling the room, as if the sigil itself had already done its work. Crowley treated these symbols as living beings, each one whispering a path into the abyss. Invocation was the heartbeat of the machinery. Unlike simple prayer, invocation in the left-hand path was not asking, it was becoming. Crowley described the act as aligning one's body and mind so completely with an entity that separation disappeared. It wasn't, "I call upon you," but rather, "I am you." He believed that by chanting in the right rhythm, breathing in the right pattern, and focusing on the right image, the boundary between human and spirit dissolved. This was how Crowley possession worked. Through ritual, identity melted into archetype, demon or god form. Crowley often contrasted his methods with those of the Golden Dawn. Where they used ritual for order and control, he used it for chaos and surrender. The machinery wasn't built to maintain balance, but to break it. He claimed that true ceremonial magic had to destabilize the self, shatter normal reality, and open a passage into the forbidden. That's why his rituals seemed so extreme, because moderation, to him, was death. If you wanted transformation, you had to be willing to bleed, burn, and be broken by the gears of the machine. The Lima wasn't gentle, it was surgical, and this machinery always led somewhere. Every sigil opened a door, every invocation summoned a presence, and those presences were not symbols, but entities, conscious, hungry, and often hostile. Crowley himself spoke of Choronzon and the terrifying guardians of the abyss. beings who tested every seeker daring to cross. If possession was the fire and ritual the engine, then the entities were the drivers. And now, to truly understand the danger of Crowley's dark doctrine, we must face the shadows he claimed to meet. Choronzon, the dweller, and the abyssal forces that fed on those who knocked. Crowley believed that no seeker could reach true power without confronting the shadows that guard the threshold of the abyss. Among them, none was more dreaded than Choronzon, the so-called dweller in the abyss. In the dark doctrine of CROWLEY, Choronzon wasn't just a demon. It was the embodiment of dispersion, madness, and illusion. To face it meant confronting every fractured part of the self, every lie, every mask, every false belief. CROWLEY Magick insisted that this wasn't an external battle, but an internal one. Choronzon wasn't lurking in the desert. Choronzon lived in the cracks of the human mind. Accounts from Crowley's rituals describe moments where the boundary between hallucination and reality seemed to dissolve. In one infamous vision, Crowley claimed to have encountered Choronzon directly, and the experience nearly devoured him. His words shifted into chaos, his thoughts splintered, his will nearly shattered. Yet he survived. And from that survival came the conviction that possession was not only a gift of entities, but also a test of endurance against forces that sought to unmake the soul. Crowley occult teachings portrayed Choronzon as the abyssal examiner, the one who strips seekers bare before they can cross. Think of it this way: every magician believes they are prepared, carrying sigils, chants, and invocations. But when they face the dweller, all tools crumble. Choronzon attacks through the mind itself, twisting thoughts into confusion, echoing desires into contradictions. Imagine trying to meditate while your own inner voice screams lies at you, insisting that nothing is real, not even your own will. That's what Crowley possession often felt like at its edge. Not harmony, but the chaos of the abyss, where even silence becomes hostile. Few adepts made it through unchanged. Crowley warned that not all entities wore monstrous forms. Some appeared as radiant angels, offering comfort, wisdom, or liberation. But in his dark doctrine, the greatest danger was mistaking these masks for truth. For him, the so-called angel could just as easily be Choronzon in disguise, luring the seeker with promises of power before dragging them deeper into illusion. This is why his ritual magic demanded ruthless discernment. He taught his followers to pierce through appearances, to question every vision, even those that seemed divine. Trust was a weakness, suspicion was survival. This paranoia became both shield and prison. Many who practiced Crowley rituals reported uncanny encounters, voices in dreams, faces forming in smoke, sudden impulses that felt foreign yet commanding. Were these messengers of wisdom or archons in disguise? Crowley taught that the only way to know was to endure, to let the possession run its course and see what remained afterward. If the will survived stronger, the entity was a teacher. If the will was shattered, the entity was the abyss itself. It was a brutal filter, one that devoured the unprepared, but there was a lure in this danger. Facing Choronzon meant stepping beyond human limitation. Those who survived often described a terrifying freedom, as if their old identities had burned away and only pure will remained. It was liberation bought with scars. Crowley's esoteric teachings suggested that even ruin was a kind of initiation, that madness itself could be a teacher. His followers whispered that to walk the left-hand path of Crowley was to gamble your sanity against the promise of transcendence, and not all were willing to pay that price. And yet, Crowley insisted the price was necessary, for beyond the dweller lay secrets that could not be touched otherwise, powers tied not to books or rituals, but to the raw engine of desire itself. He began to experiment with something even more dangerous, even more intimate: sexual magic. Desire became his sacrament, orgasm his key, and the body itself the ritual chamber. To understand how Crowley fused lust with possession, we must now step into the forbidden practice that transformed union into gateway, sexual magic, and the abyss it opens. For Crowley, desire was never just desire. It was a force of cosmic voltage. In his dark doctrine, sexuality wasn't indulgence, but invocation. Every kiss, every touch, every climax was treated as a ritual, coded with forbidden knowledge. Crowley magic transformed the body into an altar and orgasm into a key, unlocking doors into the abyss that words alone could never reach. Followers often misunderstood this, believing it was about pleasure. But in Crowley rituals, sex was not for comfort, it was for sacrifice. It was the moment when self dissolved, when possession could take hold most violently. Think of how ordinary life treats sex, as entertainment, as intimacy, sometimes as sin. Crowley saw all of this as camouflage hiding the real purpose. In ritual magic, the intensity of sexual energy could tear open the veil of consciousness, throwing the adept into direct contact with entities. Crowley possession wasn't passive here. It was fueled by ecstasy, by the raw burning of desire channeled deliberately into invocation. He taught that semen, fluids, and even the orgasmic breath carried the essence of creation itself. To spill them without purpose was waste. To channel them in ritual was power. In Thelema, do what thou wilt extended even into sexuality, but not in the way libertines hoped. It wasn't about doing whatever you liked, but about aligning desire with true will. Imagine two lovers engaging in a ritual, every movement synchronized with planetary hours, every climax timed to lunar phases. Their union wasn't romantic, it was alchemical. Crowley's esoteric teachings described these encounters as living sigils, where flesh and spirit inscribed themselves upon each other, leaving marks that extended far beyond the bedroom. Desire, properly harnessed, became a tool of ceremonial magic, sharper than any dagger, but the practice was not without risk. Just as fire can warm or burn, Crowley's sexual magic could elevate or destroy. Some adepts reported visions of entities entering through the very moment of climax, reshaping their thoughts for days afterward. Others described feeling drained, as if something had feasted upon them in the ritual. Crowley himself warned that sex opened not only gateways to divine contact, but also doors to parasitic forces hungry for energy. The machinery of possession didn't distinguish between angel and archon. Desire was a universal key, but one that could open cages as easily as palaces. This is why Crowley spoke of sex as a ritual death. The orgasm, he claimed, was a rehearsal for dying, an instant where selfhood flickers out and something else takes its place. In this gap, entities could enter and will could be rewritten. Crowley occult teachings treated this not as metaphor, but as mechanics. Followers who engaged in sexual magic reported that sometimes they couldn't tell where their own desire ended and another's influence began. The boundary blurred. In this blurring, Crowley saw liberation. The ego burned away, leaving only the raw current of true will. Yet he also admitted the cost. Sex magic left scars, both seen and unseen. It tested relationships, eroded trust, and sometimes broke disciples entirely. Some became obsessed, unable to distinguish ritual from daily life, living in cycles of endless lust and exhaustion. Others mistook indulgence for initiation, confusing pleasure with power. Crowley's dark doctrine didn't hide these dangers. It embraced them. For him, risk was the mark of authenticity. If the ritual didn't shake you, terrify you, or change you irreversibly, then it hadn't truly opened the abyss. And this abyss always exacted payment. Crowley himself spiraled into addiction and ruin, his body bearing the marks of his experiments. His followers, too, were split. Some transformed into vessels of strength, others shattered by forces they couldn't control. To walk the path of sexual magic was to gamble one's sanity against the promise of transcendence. And so the question lingers: what happens when the doctrine devours its own prophet? To answer this, we must confront the final cost of Crowley's path, the descent into madness, ruin, and shadowed disciples. Every doctrine demands a price, and Crowley's was no exception. His dark doctrine, forged in possession, ritual magic, and forbidden knowledge, consumed not only his disciples, but the prophet himself. By the end of his life, Aleister Crowley was a man hollowed out, addicted, paranoid, and impoverished. Once the self-proclaimed beast, he now looked more like a ruin of his former grandeur. Thelema had promised liberation, yet his body bore the scars of excess and experimentation. Crowley rituals had given him glimpses of power, but the constant toll of possession left him worn, a living warning to those who followed his left-hand path. Disciples who walked with him often shared the same fate. Some sought transformation and found it. Men and women who claimed Crowley possession had burned away their false selves, leaving them with clarity and will. But for many others, the rituals left nothing but chaos. Addiction, mental collapse, broken relationships. These were the shadows of Crowley magic. Followers whispered of adepts who lost themselves entirely, wandering as if permanently possessed, unable to tell dream from waking life. The cost of Crowley occult teachings was unpredictable. You might emerge a god, or you might dissolve into madness. This duality made the doctrine both alluring and terrifying. For every story of ruin, there was another of profound awakening. Some disciples swore that Crowley's teachings freed them from religious chains, societal masks, and personal fears. They credited the law of Thelema with giving them the courage to live authentically. Yet even these victories were haunted. Liberation came with scars, memories of rituals too intense to forget, entities too real to deny. To be transformed by Crowley rituals was to carry the abyss inside you forever. Crowley himself embodied this paradox. He claimed victory, insisting that his possession was proof of authenticity, that ruin was merely the shedding of falsehood. Yet letters, diaries, and the testimony of his closest followers reveal a man devoured by his own machinery. His body withered under addiction, his finances collapsed. His reputation spiraled from feared occult master to tabloid scandal. Crowley had preached that true will was beyond morality, yet society judged him harshly, branding him the wickedest man in the world. In some ways, that title became the final mask he could not remove. But to dismiss him as a failure would miss the point. Even in ruin, his shadow stretched far. Followers carried fragments of his dark doctrine into their own circles, keeping alive the rituals, the invocations, the whispers of possession. Some became leaders of their own esoteric orders, spreading Crowley occult practices long after his death. Others integrated his teachings into art, literature, and politics, disguising magic in the language of culture. Crowley may have died in poverty, but his doctrine outlived him, echoing through disciples who saw both gift and curse in his path. The cost of Crowley's teachings, then, is not just measured in his own decline, but in the legacy of his followers. Some thrived, others fell, but all carried the mark of the abyss. Possession is never free. It demands flesh, sanity, or soul as payment. Crowley insisted that this was the proof of authenticity. If a teaching does not wound, it cannot heal. If a ritual does not risk destruction, it cannot birth transformation. To follow Crowley was to accept the gamble, knowing the abyss might swallow you whole. And yet, even as the doctrine exacted its price, its influence didn't fade. From secret lodges to hidden gatherings, from underground rituals to modern culture, Crowley's shadow kept moving. His dark doctrine was too potent to die with him. And so the question becomes, how does his possession-driven magic continue to echo through our own time, shaping both secret orders and popular culture? That answer unfolds in the next chapter, the echo of Crowley in modern magic. Crowley may have died broken in body, but his dark doctrine never stayed buried. In fact, its echoes ripple louder today than they did in his lifetime. Secret orders, some direct descendants of the Golden Dawn, others born in hidden corners of the left-hand path, quietly preserved his rituals and teachings. For them, CROWLEY magic wasn't a relic, it was living machinery, still capable of possession and transformation. Thelema, once whispered in dim chambers, became a framework that shaped entire generations of esoteric seekers. CROWLEY occult knowledge proved too dangerous, too alluring to be forgotten. But the doctrine didn't remain locked in temples and lodges. Its symbols seeped into the bloodstream of culture itself. Think of rock music in the 1960s and 70s. Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, Black Sabbath, all flirted with CROWLEY's image and ideas. Do What Thou Wilt appeared on album covers, not as philosophy, but as spellwork disguised in pop culture. Ritual magic, once confined to esoteric orders, danced in lyrics, posters, and concerts. CROWLEY possession had moved from secret rituals to the stage, where thousands chanted along unknowingly. The beast had found a new altar, the crowd, and it didn't stop at music. Cinema, literature, and even politics carried CROWLEY's fingerprints. Hollywood films drew on the archetypes of possession, ritual, and forbidden knowledge, weaving his dark doctrine into horror and fantasy. Writers like Alan Moore and filmmakers like Kenneth Anger turned CROWLEY occult teachings into living art. Even in politics, whispers of ceremonial magic appeared in conspiracy theories, symbols and rituals hidden in plain sight. Whether adored or feared, the machinery of CROWLEY rituals kept turning, disguised as entertainment, propaganda, or rebellion. Pop culture gave CROWLEY a second life, one where the line between occult and mainstream blurred. Teenagers wore sigils on t-shirts, not knowing they were ancient locks. Bands invoked Thelema in lyrics, never realizing they were repeating invocations. This was the genius and the danger of CROWLEY magic. Once released, it could hide in plain sight, its words and symbols functioning as unconscious spells. Thelema was no longer just a doctrine of occultists. It was a current flowing through culture, disguised as rebellion, art, and fashion. Yet secret orders never lost their grip on his teachings. Hidden lodges still practiced the rituals, some faithful to CROWLEY's exact instructions, others adapting them into modern forms of left-hand path initiation. Whispered accounts tell of ceremonies where possession is still invoked, where Choronzon is still confronted, where sexual magic fuels forbidden experiments. CROWLEY's dark doctrine remains a living fire, passed in shadows from teacher to disciple. For those inside, it's not history, it's happening now. CROWLEY rituals have never stopped, they've only grown more discreet. The paradox is striking. CROWLEY was condemned as the wickedest man in the world, yet his ideas became woven into mainstream culture so deeply that most don't even recognize them. His dark doctrine was both curse and prophecy. Destroy the prophet and the shadow grows stronger. Ban his name and his symbols multiply. His possession lives not only in secret initiates, but in anyone who repeats his words, wears his signs, or hums along to a song infused with his doctrine. CROWLEY occult knowledge thrives because it hides in plain sight. And so, every whisper of CROWLEY in modern culture is more than nostalgia, it's continuation. His doctrine survives because it became a mirror reflecting the soul of each new generation. Which leads us to the final reflection. The dark doctrine of CROWLEY isn't just about history, rituals, or entities. It's about the seeker staring into the abyss and asking, do I control the magic I invoke, or has it already taken control of me? That is the essence of the closing reflection, the doctrine as mirror of the soul. CROWLEY's dark doctrine was never meant to be read like a manual. It was meant to be lived like a haunting. To study it is to discover that every ritual, every possession, every fragment of forbidden knowledge is less about spirits outside and more about shadows within. Aleister Crowley framed himself as the beast, but what unsettles us is the possibility that he was simply showing us what lurks in every human soul, the hunger for power, the fear of surrender, the temptation of the abyss. Crowley occult teachings turn the mirror back on the seeker. Are you invoking the entity, or is the entity already whispering through you? Thelema crystallized this paradox. Do what thou wilt wasn't just his law. It was an initiation into the reality that freedom and slavery can look identical. To act in alignment with true will is liberation, but to mistake ego for demon is to become possessed without knowing it. Crowley rituals dramatized this tension, making each ceremony a gamble. The circle on the floor wasn't simply geometry. It was the fragile boundary between control and surrender. The law is simple, but living it is labyrinthine. For the self is both key and trap. Every student of Crowley discovers that magic is less about angels and demons than about identity itself. Possession, in his dark doctrine, wasn't only about entities entering flesh. It was about confronting how easily the self fractures, how quickly will bends under unseen pressures. Choronzon, the dweller, the abyss, they might be cosmic forces, or they might be metaphors for our own fragmented minds. Either way, the effect is the same. Once you open the door, you cannot close it without leaving something of yourself behind. That's the nature of forbidden knowledge. It marks you. Crowley himself became the proof and the warning. His life shows both the heights of ceremonial magic and the depths of ruin. Addiction, poverty, paranoia, all of these were prices paid for possession. Yet his shadow still lingers because his doctrine resonates with something universal. The yearning to transcend limits, even if it means destruction. Crowley magic lives because the abyss lives in all of us. His failure was not proof of falsehood, but the demonstration of its cost. Every scar on his body was a lesson inscribed in flesh. What unsettles many is that the dark doctrine doesn't tell us what to believe. It forces us to choose. Do we embrace ceremonial magic as a path to empowerment, or fear it as a snare? Do we see Crowley as prophet or madman, teacher or warning? Thelema leaves no neutral ground. By studying Crowley occult teachings, you're already in the labyrinth, already negotiating with your own shadows. And that is why the doctrine is mirror as much as doctrine. It reflects not Crowley alone, but the one who dares to read him. This mirror can be merciless. It doesn't flatter, it doesn't lie. It shows you your will, your lusts, your fractures, and asks, are these yours, or are they the whispers of something else? For some, that recognition leads to clarity. For others, it leads to collapse. Thelema doesn't promise safety. It promises truth. And truth, as Crowley proved, is often unbearable. Yet it is also irresistible, because once you glimpse it, the ordinary world seems pale and hollow by comparison. That is the dangerous beauty of the left-hand path. And so, as we close this reflection, the question lingers like incense in a sealed room. When you look into the doctrine, do you see Crowley, or do you see yourself staring back? The dark doctrine of Crowley was never just his possession. It is an invitation for yours. And the whisper of the beast still echoes, daring you to step closer to the abyss and discover if you command the forces you summon or if they already command you. So now the mirror is in front of you. You've seen how the dark doctrine of Crowley wasn't just about rituals, but about possession, will, and the dangerous promise of liberation. The question is no longer about him, it's about you. What would you risk to discover your true will? Would you dare to open doors that might never close? Or would you rather stay where it's safe, knowing that safety itself may be the greatest illusion? Crowley's path forces us to ask, are we the masters of our choices? Or are we already being whispered into by forces we can't name? Look at your life right now. How much of what you do is truly yours? And how much is programming, chains, shadows inherited from others? Thelema was never about easy answers. It was about tearing away masks until only truth remained, even if that truth devoured you. But here's the real challenge. Knowledge means nothing if it isn't lived. You've walked through these doctrines with me, but what will you do with them? Will you bury them as curiosities, or will you use them as fuel to rewrite your story? Remember, transformation never comes without risk. The abyss isn't out there, it's already inside you, waiting. So I'll leave you with this. What if the whispers you've been ignoring are not distractions, but invitations? What if your power begins where your fear ends? Think about it. And if you're ready to keep walking deeper into these forbidden teachings, then subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and stay with me. Because this journey doesn't end here, the doctrine is only beginning.